Greetings, Bob Fowler here, introducing the fifth and final session of the series that I've been calling the Provocative Parables of Jesus. If you've been with me in past weeks, past sessions, we've covered a lot of ground. I've been concentrating very heavily on an exploration of how the gospel writers have helped us to understand the parables in the way they wanted us to understand them. And there were four characteristics of the Gospels that we have walked through session by session. First of all, there are editorial differences between the various versions of the parables. Any parable that occurs more than once, the wording will not be the same. There will be differences, sometimes significant differences, between the different versions of a parable. Then, invariably, the gospel writers work hard to provide a setting or narrative framework to surround a parable, which, again, clues us in as to what they think the parable is really all about. Number three, the gospel writers frequently add morals to the end of the story. They summarize what they think the story is about, and we can heed their suggestion or go our own way if we wish. Then fourth and finally, allegorizing interpretations, and that's what we're going to deal with today. Allegorizing interpretations. The gospel writers sometimes, not very often, but sometimes they treat the parables as if they were coded stories begging for decoding. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, here we go. This is the first of hopefully three parables that I'd like to look at and to look at the allegorical decoding of them. This is the all-time classic, the sower parable, which occurs actually in four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas. I threw in the Thomas version because it lacks the allegorical interpretation at the end. We are beholden to Mark for the allegorical interpretation that's tacked on to the end of this parable. And then Matthew and Luke, each in his own way, followed in Mark's footsteps. Matthew and Luke both get the sower parable and its allegorical interpretation from Mark, and they each put their own particular slant on it, which we could talk about forever. But the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have the allegorical interpretation, which suggests that the story circulated once upon a time without an allegorical interpretation. So let's look at the story in Mark, and we will move on. We'll unpack the story a bit, and then we'll move on and talk about its allegorical interpretation. Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on a path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, if you have ears to hear, then hear. I need to unpack this story. I need to tell you a little bit about ancient agricultural practices, which matter a great deal in comprehending what this story is saying. I am very much indebted to the German scholar Joachim Jeremias, who was a pioneering student of the parables and published heavily in the middle of the 20th century. Jeremias had the good fortune as a kid to be with his parents in Palestine back in the early years of the 20th century, before the modern state of Israel was founded. So Jeremias had firsthand experience of the geography, the climate, the cultural practices. I think probably some of the ancient agricultural practices, at least, must have been continued into the early 20th century. So Jeremias had a personal acquaintance with down to earth life in Israel Palestine, and he used that to great effect in interpreting the parables of Jesus. Jeremias offers this interpretation of what's really going on in the story, and it's very different from modern Western agricultural practice. Back on the Fowler family farm in Kansas when I was growing up, we would plow the ground first, then maybe disc it to break up the clods, and then and only then plant seed. This story, though, involves scattering seed broadly, indiscriminately, and then plowing it under. So on the Fowler family farm, we plowed, disked first, put out seed second. This puts out seed first, then plows it under. And that's why the farmer is dealing with multiple situations in his field, but he's doing the best he can with what he's got. The path, seed scattered out on the path. This is a footpath. He and his neighbors walk across the field and they beat down the earth in a pathway across the field, and he's going to plow that up. So he broadcasts the seed, and if the birds don't get it all, he's going to plow it under as best he can. And who knows, maybe this season the path will be 10 yards over in the field. So he's going to put the seed out there, plow it under, and hope for the best. Similarly for the rocky ground, he's not an idiot. He's not putting seed on rock. He's putting it on ground that has rock underneath it, out of sight. There's a layer of rock underneath the soil, just a few inches down, and therefore he can't see exactly where this rocky underlayer is, but he knows it's out there somewhere. So again, he scatters the seed generously, indiscriminately, and he will do the best he can to plow that seed under. Of course, it won't grow very well because there's no room for root to grow. But he's doing the best he can with what he's got. And then similarly with the thorns, let's say there's one corner of his field that is given to weeds. Year after year, he knows the weeds really like to take off in that corner, but he doesn't know exactly down to the inch where the weeds are going to be strong and where something of a crop can be raised. So again, indiscriminately, he broadcasts seed out there because he's going to plow that under and hope for the best. But there is a lot of seed that's going to go on good soil with no problems, no difficulties. Plowing that seed under is going to lead to a great harvest, 30, 60, 100-fold. I can't help but think back to parables we've already talked about in this series of sessions. Some parables about loss or failure, other parables about glory, success, grandeur. This parable talks about three ways, let's put it crudely, three ways to fail and different ways to succeed. Different ways to fail, different ways to succeed, all in one parable. I think that's quite amazing. That's quite interesting. Let's move on to the allegorical unpacking. I wish we had time to deal with all this. Maybe we can in our live session together. Um, there's there's some fun and games being played here with parabolizing. Um, uh, Jesus seems to think the disciples have the inside track, but quickly he figures out, I don't think you guys get it after all. Don't you understand? Don't you really understand? Well, let me explain to you. So Jesus begins the unpacking of the story that it's really from Mark, not from Jesus. I assure you. The sower sows the word. These are the ones on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they have no root and endure only for a while. Then, when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are those sown among the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the age and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, and it yields nothing. And these are the ones sown on the good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, 30 and 60 and 100-fold. So that's what the story is really all about. You might think the story is about farming, sowing seed, but it's really about the word. So it's a metaphorical, symbolic, poetic interpretation of what's going on. And I can assure you that scholars are in a bit of a quandary trying to figure out whether the focus is the seed itself or the soil types themselves. There's a little bit of slippage back and forth. Clearly this is about broadcasting the gospel, the good news. But it's a little fuzzy whether what really counts is the seed or what really counts is the soil. Okay, let's go on because we have a lot of ground to cover here. Feast. It occurs in three Gospels: Matthew, Luke, and Thomas, and our best representations of what Jesus probably had to say are in Luke and Thomas. And let's take a look at the Luke version. In the Luke version, he gives, shall we say, the moral of the story first, not afterwards, but up front. He said also to the one who had invited him to dinner, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers and sisters or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. Don't do nice things for people hoping to get reciprocity. Be more generous and outgoing than that. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And then Luke has Jesus tell this story as an example of that kind of behavior. Then Jesus said to him, someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of land and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets. Another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I am going to try them out. Please accept my regrets. Another said, I have just been married, and therefore I cannot come. So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, go out at once into the streets and lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. And the slave said, sir, what you have ordered has been done, and there is still room. Then the master said to the slave, go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, clearly, we're at an elite level of culture. This is rich man inviting other rich men to dinner, to a banquet. So this is upper crust, the world of the upper crust, the lifestyles of the rich and famous. And I need to explain to you that the practice present here was in the ancient world, 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean, um, there being no electricity to light things up at night, if you were going to throw a dinner party, you would want it to start middle of the afternoon and then in the evening bid your guests farewell as they make it home before it gets completely dark. Invitations were sent out in writing ahead of time. So these people all knew that they were already invited. So you send out the written invitation ahead of time, and at the time of the banquet itself, you send your slave around to collect them and accompany them coming to your banquet hall. So these people already had the invitation in hand. They are begging off at the last minute, and this is an insult to the host. They are disparaging him, they're putting him down, they're insulting him by refusing to come at the very last moment. And it's absolutely ridiculous, the excuses they give. I have bought a piece of land, I need to go look at it. As if you didn't do that before you bought the land. Or another guy buys 5 pair of oxen and he needs to go check them out. Well, again, you didn't do that before you bought them. And then the third guy remembers, oh, I've just been married. I'm not going out to other people's houses for parties. So because rich friends treat him so mean, he decides to be nice to the crippled, the blind, the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. So for unimpressive reasons, he decides to be nice, be good. So it's a marvelous story with marvelous twists and turns. Let's see what Matthew does with it, because this is completely different. Um, and no red ink here because this is not Jesus, this is Matthew. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. King, not just banquet, but wedding banquet for his son. Completely different circumstances. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. And again, he sent other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. Ooh, didn't expect that kind of rejection of the invitation. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, burned their city. A little bit excessive response, it seems to me. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. The good and the bad, both. That's an issue, that's a concern. You're going to indiscriminately invite all, but wait till we see what happens with that. Long story short, the rich guy has become a king. The banquet has become a wedding banquet for son. It's not too hard to figure out that the king is God, the son is Jesus, the wedding banquet is the celebration of the world to come, the heavenly glory, the afterlife with blessing galore for the good people, the good. So and the slaves who are either rejected or killed, that's probably the prophets of Israel and or teachers of the early Jesus movement who've been rejected by the Jewish people by and large. So so there the good news, the gospel has been rejected and people are going to suffer for it. And this seems to me to be not too veiled allusion to the calamities that befell the Jewish people in the first century. And a common Christian interpretation was that the Jews suffered in the first century and thereafter because of their rejection of God's message to them in and through Jesus. In fact, the Roman Empire devastated the Jewish homeland in the 60s and 70s of the first century. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple of God in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70. So to me, this is a not so veiled allusion to the calamities that befell the Jewish people in the first century. Let me touch on the good and the bad. Um, um, Matthew not only throws allegorical interpretation into the story itself. The allegorical unpacking is embedded in the story itself. But in addition to that, he throws in this extra story at the end, which is completely wild and crazy. The king came in to see the guests, and he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. He'd been grabbed in off the street, and he's going to get into trouble because he's not wearing a tuxedo. He said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" And the guy was speechless. I would be, I think. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen." This is Matthew. This is not Jesus. This is Matthew. Matthew has this thing about the good and the bad together in the household of faith. Matthew thinks that in the end, look at Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats must be separated. There's going to be good people and bad people in the church, in the household of faith, among the people of God. And in the end, the good from the bad has to be separated. Weeping and gnashing of teeth, that's a phrase from Matthew. I looked this up. I did a software search to verify my memory. 6 times in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a reference to weeping and gnashing of teeth. He loves this image as an image of eternal damnation, eternal torment that is to befall the bad people. Weeping and gnashing of teeth, 6 times in Matthew's Gospel. This phrase does occur once in Luke, but only once, and nowhere else is it used anywhere in the Gospels. So this is very, very much a Matthew phrase. And it's Matthew's feeling that the good and the bad are all mixed up together, but God will sort it out someday in the end. All right. One last example. We're looking here at C.H. Dodd, The Parables of the Kingdom, and this is from St. Augustine. This is Augustine's allegorical unpacking of the Good Samaritan. And this is wild and crazy. uh, I wish we had time to deal with this at great length, but we can zip through this and hit some highlights. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Adam himself is meant. Did you know that? Did you know that the guy in the story of the Good Samaritan, the guy goes down from Jerusalem down to the river valley, Jericho. That's Adam. Who knew? Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace. Jericho means the moon. I thought it was a city down in the Jordan River Valley, but Augustine says, oh, that's the moon, and it signifies our mortality. Thieves are the devil and his angels. I didn't see that either. They stripped him, beat him, left him half dead. The priest and the Levite, here's more Christian slander against the Jews, I'm sorry to say. The priest and the Levite who saw him and passed by signify the priesthood and ministry of the Old Testament, which could profit nothing for salvation. So it's a backhanded slap at the Jewish tradition and how any good Christian would want to leave that behind and not give it any respect. Oh, this next point is really nice. Samaritan means guardian. I'm not sure it does, but be that as it may. Therefore, the Lord Jesus Christ himself is signified by this name. The Samaritan in the Good Samaritan parable is Jesus himself, according to Blessed Saint Augustine. I didn't know that. I it's not, but it's an interesting point to ponder. That Jesus was a good neighbor to any and all he encountered, and therefore he'd be a good candidate to be the Samaritan in this story. The binding of the wounds, oil, wine, the beast is the flesh in which Jesus came to live among us. Oh, this is another great one. The inn to which the Samaritan took the beaten up guy is the church, where travelers returning to their heavenly country are refreshed after pilgrimage. I did not know that the Christian church featured in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who knew? The morrow, the 2 pence. The innkeeper. Did you know the Apostle Paul appears in the parable of the Good Samaritan? According to Augustine, he does. So, wow. And I think that's a good place to break off. The innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. The Samaritan is Jesus. The inn is the Christian church. Clearly, Augustine is laying out his catechism of Christian instruction, and he's packing it all into his interpretation of one parable only. And this is quite an amazing performance. An amazing performance. And C.H. Dodd, to whom I've referred a number of times in this series of classes, C.H. Dodd points out that Archbishop Trench, Anglican archbishop back in the 1800s, picked up this model and pursued it even more zealously. And so this kind of interpretation has been very, very common in the history of Christianity, but it's relatively rare in the Gospels. I picked out, I think, probably the three juiciest, well, two of the three examples I've looked at are in the Gospels themselves. Augustine is not in the Gospels. He's in the late 4th, early 5th century CE. So, but this kind of interpretation has been ubiquitous, been all over the place in the Christian tradition for centuries and centuries and centuries. And it's only in the modern era, the 1800s, 1900s, 20th century, it's only been in recent times that scholars work hard to get us out of this and into a more thoughtful, insightful understanding of what Jesus probably had in mind as he was telling his provocative stories. And with that, I think we're going to call it good. And I hope you have picked up something from this, given I hope you have some thoughts and some questions, some insights, and things you'd like to discuss. I've enjoyed making these presentations, and thanks for participating. Take care. Grace and peace.